Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Kevin Bardosh, Director and Head of Research at Collateral Global, a UK-based think tank dedicated to researching the global impacts of COVID-19 policy responses. I welcome Kevin Bardosh to Savage Minds. What brought you from Seattle to the UK to become the Director and Head of Research at Collateral Global? Due to the fact that working in this field as a journalist, I've seen how every country is handling the quote-unquote truth and reconciliation related to what went wrong with the pandemic mitigation strategies, lockdown itself, all the nonsense associated with that. The videos and the FAQs about washing your hands and this kind of gel and social distancing. Could you talk a bit about what you're doing there in relation to what we've all been through since 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of my own personal story, I'm a medical anthropologist by background. I've worked in international development and public health programs in over 20 countries around the world. So I'm very much a social chameleon. I also did my PhD in Edinburgh and left about 10 years ago. So I'm not a stranger to the UK. I think also, I also spent a considerable amount of time during the pandemic in France and Germany with my family. I have 3 kids. And so I think that plays into this broader question of what is Collateral Global and what are we trying to do? I mean, it's an interesting name, right? It's a pun on collateral damage, but the global there is important because COVID was in many ways one of the first global events in the totalizing sense of the word. And so with social media, you could instantly see what was happening around the world in different countries. And there was also this uniformity of viewpoint, no matter what type of government was in power, whether it was a country in Africa, in Asia, or in Latin America, or wherever, there was this sort of totalizing vision of what we needed to do, which was a war against the virus. And what I'm finding is actually at a national level. So the conversation about the academics who pushed back against that narrative and sort of the trials and tribulations that they went through is actually also a common story in many different countries. And so we're dealing with a very complicated social phenomenon here, but we're also dealing with an industry of fear, and public health does good things, right? But it also has a propensity for overreaction, for fearmongering, and also for for a kind of particular ideological bent towards social action, which is we need governments to intervene and create rules and regulations for everyone else's good. So, I mean, I can kind of continue on that along sort of talking about that, but to kind of get back to the question, which was, well, what are we doing at Collateral Global? We are creating an infrastructure for scientists and public intellectuals and others who experienced COVID in a sort of more of a heterodox perspective, and want to really investigate and think critically about that period, the COVID years, and in order to also learn those lessons, so the next time there's a health emergency, we don't throw evidence-based policy out the window. We don't throw out the basis of public policy, which is considering trade-offs, right? We had a co-optation of public policy, which was we have to follow the science, but public policy doesn't follow science. Public policy has to make sense of competing interests and make a decision based on on those trade-offs. And that was a framework that was completely tossed out the window. And then sort of the third arm of a lot of the things that we concentrate on are democratic norms, which were also suspended for much of the pandemic. And so people might think, oh, this is something in the rear view mirror. Oh, that was a sort of an unfortunate sort of overreaction, perhaps. But now we've moved on. The problem is we haven't. The folks who constructed those policies from an academic and political well, not so much political, but from the academic standpoint, have in most cases been promoted. So if you look at like research centers that have gotten most academic grants, those have gone to people who, modeled astronomical figures of COVID deaths or exaggerated the benefits of lockdown or school closures or whatever. And so the institution, at the institutional level, we have like a lock-in around what I call the lockdown doctrine. And it's a very particular political doctrine, actually. And so if we're going to have another health emergency, which we're going to invariably, I think we're going to see that machinery come roaring back into action. So, yeah.
I'm thinking a lot about the language you just used to describe the industry of fear, the war against this virus. And we saw this in 2001 after the World Trade Center, Pentagon, et cetera, incidents with post 9/11. And we've also got a cultural paradigm here where people have been pushed by governments, not just in the US, but especially ours, to think about fighting terror, right? I've written a book on what happened post 9/11 with the 14,000 disappeared Muslim men. And what you saw on the MTA all over New York City was this kind of ideology. See something, say something. You'd see images, you'd be sitting in front of them, of course, but on the walls of the subway, on the inside of the subway trains, with a bag under a seat, and see something, say something. That could be a bomb. So we're already reacting. A state of fear has been implanted in us even prior to COVID. People have been set up with see something, say something. And I was alarmed. Again, I'm in Italy, so we were sort of this very perverse ground zero for what happened. And people were very willing to stick it out because the government brainwashed everyone by talking about grandma and grandpa, right?
Right.
So it's for the nonno, it's for the nonna, and, just do it. Well, wait a second. I was living in a tiny condominium building of mostly elderly people. We were one of the youngest people, another apartment as well, in the entire building. And all the elderly were having parties nightly. And we were like, wait, we're supposed to be in lockdown. And they're like having parties. It was sort of this perverse rear window scene, if you recall the Jimmy Stewart watching the woman doing cha-cha-cha lessons with all the men. But we were listening to the cha-cha-cha upstairs and downstairs. And I kept thinking, are we being punked? I mean, is this for real? Are we really in a lockdown? Are we overreacting here? So, of course we weren't. It's just a lot of people broke lockdown, and including the octogenarians in our building. They were, they wanted to see their grandkids, and it came down to that. Now, what really floored me from early on, Kevin, is how it went from shutting down travel and people couldn't go to school. 10 days later in Italy, it became nobody could leave the house, except if you had a dog. So there were perverse schemes. I swear, I've interviewed people who said, oh yeah, my neighbor lent me her dog so I could go outside and get some fresh air.
Yeah, of course.
What on earth do you think got into the minds of politicians to engage in this? Or rather, as you said earlier, everyone was on the same page. And here I am. I'm sure you're aware the Phillips screwdriver in Canada is a square screwdriver. We have different types of odd screwdrivers around the world. We have all these regions on DVDs, but suddenly a pandemic came along and we're all saying the same thing, right? Isn't that odd?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I think it really hammers home. I mean, and you see this throughout history, right? Like modern history, let's say, going back even to sort of the beginning of the nation state, that you have these powerful meta narratives that take hold in a society, and the state and the scientific establishment are joined together, right? And it's part of the state building process. And then you have the excommunicated sort of heretics, who are persecuted, and then you have the in and out group, and what we saw was that exact process that's happened time and time again throughout history, and it's not really something that we can necessarily transcend fully when society is infused with fear. Fear does really strange things to people. You can't actually think rationally when you're scared, right? It
Right.
sets up like a cascade of cognitive bias that takes hold. And one of the extreme things with COVID, so there's sort of two things here that I'll mention about the overarching experience. One is that the original sin with COVID was that we got the risk assessment wrong as a society from the beginning, right? This was a disease with a very clear age distribution, like very clear. And it was quite clear really pretty early on, right? And so there should have never been this whole communication about everyone is at risk, right? And that's the original sin of the COVID response, was that everyone's at equal risk, and hence we need to shut down all of society in this absolutely unprecedented manner. Okay, but the second part of this is you could envision a situation where a disease doesn't have that risk distribution, right? Where the disease is more deadly, it affects young people, right? And in that scenario, you can envision that we would still be in various forms of lockdown today, if that was the case. Our society is primed to actually re-engineer the basis of social interaction based on a viral threat. And I think that there's a lot of like historical forces that are at work there that have structured like the way that we deal with death, the way that our societies are digitalized, right? So that allows people to actually work from home. Sort of the way that we've raised young people, sort of the culture of safetyism, and sort of the deterioration of a notion of individual responsibility and freedom as the basis of Western civilization, and lots of other things we can sort of talk about. But so I'm also concerned that we're not thinking of those possible scenarios in the not so distant future, which is not completely an absurd idea of facing a pathogen with a higher death rate. And you can actually sort of, with some reasonable imagination, think about just how dramatic society is going to be changed in that scenario. And I'm a firm believer that our panic is more destructive than the actual threat that we face. And so, like my work right now is developing a field of research that I've called public health harm. And this is a very like commonsensical idea. It's just that every public health intervention or policy has trade-offs. And researching those trade-offs, those harms, helps researchers and policymakers appreciate those unintended consequences, and with that hopefully we can make better decisions. So that's one of the things that we're doing at Collateral Global, is just so, for example, doing, and I did a global meta study, what I call the state of knowledge review, where I synthesized the academic research on harm from COVID policies. So this was everything. So the motivation for the piece of work was, okay, so you have this cognitive bias that has prioritized COVID, the virus, the infection, the mortality from infection, over the harms of policies. So one of the problems with that is it's easy to cognitively to say, oh, we let's track COVID deaths, let's track COVID cases. And then when you're thinking about COVID policy harms, how do you even think about that? So the work that I did created a framework of 10 categories and 50 subcategories of harm, of social consequences. And so we have this framework now, and we're using that at a country level to evaluate, in Canada, what were the social harms from COVID policies, in the UK, in Italy, in the US. And I think that that's an important thing to do, just for people to appreciate that, the scale of disruption was really quite dramatic and drastic. So with COVID, like, we have a very clear example of an overreaction. And one of the sort of other concerns that I find is sort of a reluctance or an inability, and this again is a sort of gets back to human nature, of individuals in positions of power, once they've come out and said, we need to do this, we need to do, we need to close schools, we need to do lockdowns, we need vaccine mandates, we need to mask 2-year-olds in New York City or whatever it is, to then go back and say, actually, I was wrong, right? That's a very rare individual that will actually do that. And sort of the thing is, everyone sort of went along with it, because we are told in classic public health ideology, again, it's a moralization discourse, right? Like, you need to do this because it's in the good of the community. How dare you question, you selfish individual, right?
Right.
And so everyone sort of got along, and it's a very small percentage. And it's fascinating, actually. It's consistent in different countries, and over time it's about 20% of the population. And this gets back to some like experiments like the Milgram experiment, right, where they like, you kind of have this small minority of people that are willing, they're either crazy enough or strong-headed enough or strong-willed enough to stand up against the herd and say, wait, what's happening here? The social momentum, I don't agree with that. I don't think we should do that. And those people are very valuable, actually, in an emergency, right? Those are the individuals who are like, hey, maybe we shouldn't run across the trenches in World War I and just be mowed down by machine guns. I mean, and sort of like that whole, like, sort of mass psychology, it's a useful lens. I know people, they don't like to kind of use World War I and World War II metaphors to talk about COVID, but I actually do think that there's some useful analogs there. So
Well, absolutely. I've used them quite a bit regarding this and other things. I mean, I've worked on, since 2012, the issue of quote unquote transgender medicine and the harms it's causing to various populations, not least of which children. And it's phenomenal that people can talk very negatively and factually about Mengele, but let's just sterilize a generation of kids with no hesitation because they've been trained to say that. It's not that they're evil people. They've been taught that this is good. And when lockdown happened, in fact, I said to another journalist, I said, well, it's a no-brainer, lockdown. We've already been indoctrinated to the female penis. This is easy. And I mean, I didn't mean it even to be funny, but of course it is funny because it's so absurd. I mean, we've put the jumping the shark into the rearview mirror. We've been jumping sharks all along now. And what struck me, I've had, Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff on the show as well, early, back in 2020. And both of them warned about the socioeconomic impacts. Now, a lot of people think socioeconomic impacts, they're seeing children cleaning shoes in Managua, Nicaragua, or the Dalit in India, unable to eat. But it was far worse. It was bad also in the developing world, or what is called the global south, but it was devastating everywhere. And nobody's talking about that, especially the media.
Yeah. I mean, so the people are talking about it. I would say we're actually in an interesting moment of, I was having this conversation with a colleague the other day of a new journalism. So we have, I mean, we're on it right now. It's a podcast, right?
Exactly.
But there's a lot of outfits. Like, I write for Unheard. There's the Free Press. There's Spiked. The City Journal. There's a lot of new and up and coming media outlets that are nuanced, and actually that's one of the words that I like to focus on. In fact, one of my favorite pictures that I took during the pandemic was when we were in France, in southern France, in, like, this was October of 2020. And it's a photo of a small little church out in the middle of nowhere. And the graveyard, it's a very small graveyard, and it's closed. And there's a sign in French saying the graveyard is closed until further notice because of COVID. And, it's a great picture. The sun is kind of shining on it. And I call it the death of nuance, because I mean, we close cemeteries, right? And it's like people, we've lost the ability. I mean, I think the ability has always been challenging, actually, to have nuance. It's not everyone who can think in those shades of gray, but as a society, we're living more and more where the political discourse, a lot of people feel completely out of touch with it, right? So you say, and that's the other thing with COVID that's fascinating, is those 20% of people who were, who stood up and thought, oh, wait a second, something's not right. I'm not going to just go along with the social herd. They were from all ends of the political spectrum, right?
Exactly.
It's true, though, that they are more overwhelmingly conservative or right wing in there's more of them that did stand up, but they do cut across the whole spectrum itself. And so I think, and we're seeing this even with the whole discourse around the far right now. We just had European, parliamentary elections. I think there's a sort of yearning and confusion around what is the future of politics? And COVID certainly plays into rearranging that whole landscape.
Oh, completely. I launched Savage Minds during the lockdowns because, well, I say plural because Italy was in and out of them always. And I'm a leftist. Listeners know this. The people who subscribe to Savage Minds, however, are across the political spectrum, because one thing that the gender debate brought me to the teetering point of was a kind of nauseum over this political correctness that, oh, you're not of my thinking? Well, I can't have you on the show. And that's ridiculous. The whole point of journalism is to cover facts, not to give people what they want. And I fear that a lot of people on the left, a lot of my cohorts, they just want what they want. That's, Trump derangement syndrome. People think started after he left office. No, it started when he was on the political trail. I saw it. And I was in London. I was living in England. I voted against Brexit. But when the vote came in, I'm like, okay, we lost. And then I was alarmed by the pushback, people wanting a revote, do it again. That was wrong. And I'm thinking, well, democracy is really in a tilting position right now, because the very people who claim to love their country and democracy, and I hate to say it, a lot of them are not on the right, are the very ones putting us in parallel because they don't accept the vote, or they don't accept that maybe their governments lied to them. And this has happened now, and look what's coming out. I mean, the socioeconomic impacts have resulted in loss of life. Here in Italy, how many hundreds of thousands of people were not diagnosed properly for cancer because many people were too afraid to go outside. I saw this. You still have people, when I go to the pharmacy, I talk to people all the time here, and they are talking about relatives who still haven't left the house. They've developed a phobia because of how severe the lockdown was here. And then, you have the impacts of exclusion from work and social life that we saw. Remember, if you weren't standing on the balcony clapping or clapping for the NHS and saying, why are we being told to do this? Then you were persona non grata. And so what your work, I've read some of what you've written as well last year. I'm going to quote you because I found this really great. In 14 May 2023, you wrote, "How did the COVID pandemic response harm society? A global evaluation and state knowledge review 2020-2021. That was the title, sorry. And so you wrote about this 119-page study where you detail in finite detail, actually, where the findings examined the societal and scientific effects of forcing a novel vaccine on millions of Americans. And you write, our analysis strongly suggests that mandatory COVID-19 vaccine policies have had damaging effects on public trust, vaccine confidence, political polarization, human rights, inequities, and social well-being. We question the effectiveness and consequences, of course, of vaccine policy in pandemic response and urge the public health community and policymakers to return to non-discriminatory, trust-based public health approaches." And when I read this, Kevin, I was like, yes, because here in Italy, I got a fine. I keep getting them sent to me. You're fined because I'm over 50. I did not take that vaccine. No way. Ironically, today, my kids had a play date to see some friends. And the mother of the children they were visiting is a healthcare worker here. She was forced to take the vaccines, many, and she's had a debilitating lung problem since. Not only will the government and the health authorities not recognize this, they don't have the paper trail for her vaccine. She has the slips, but it's like disappeared. And she says, it's not just me, there's other people that we can't get sick leave now. And so slowly but surely, we're seeing that what people were saying back in 2021 about, wait, this is very rushed. What about the studies? Filmmakers have made films. I don't know if you've seen Jennifer Sharp's work on this subject. No. The whole point of testing, and what is the average lifespan of testing, it tends to be around 10 years. Okay, it's a pandemic, we get that, but it went so fast. And now you've got loads of people sick. How can you prove it's related to the vaccine? It couldn't, might it be coincidental? So how do you situate this within public health? Because it seems to me that every single thing, it's almost like the government's tried to do the wrong thing, because I don't know if they got anything right. everything was so badly done, but these vaccine mandates forcing populations of young people to get vaccinated seems to have eroded not only trust in public health care, but as you mentioned earlier, if there is, and there will be, another pandemic, and if
Yeah.
that pandemic is a stronger form of a viral exchange,
Yeah.
people aren't going to necessarily listen, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. So the quote that you read is from a different paper. That it's a different title. It's the unintended consequences of COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Why or policy, why mandates, passports, and restrictions may cause more harm than good. So that was a study that we released actually in early 2022 as a preprint. This was like February of 2022, just as the same week that the Canadian trucker convoy started. And I'm a Canadian American dual citizen, and and it was so amazing to release a study saying, I mean, it's almost like we have a quote in the paper like, this is going to lead to huge, massive civil unrest. And then you have the Canadian trucker convoy start. So like we certainly got the pulse of the moment. And in the paper, we outline, I think there's 4 or 5 different areas of harm, and there's probably like 12 or 13 hypotheses that we have. And one of them is exactly about the side effects. We say, this is a new vaccine, you're mandating it. So just by the nature of human psychology, you're going to have reactants, meaning you're trying to take people's freedom away, and certain individuals will react very strongly to that. And you're setting up, like we're speaking to the public health community, we're basically say you're setting yourself up for a generational crisis of confidence in vaccines across the board. Like and part of it is also that you're just not being transparent with the public. So very early on, getting back to the original sin of COVID, like any vaccine that was developed, it should have been, which is what I thought was going to happen, or the original rollout of the vaccine program was, hey, we're going to target the most vulnerable and healthcare workers and people with really bad comorbidities. It should have stayed at that level of the population. We had vaccine mandates for universities across North America. I also wrote a paper and did a lot of media pieces about that. I mean, where we were mandating, an 18-year-old who had COVID already to get a booster shot, or else you can't go to university, right? And I got emails from people, students saying like, I had COVID twice, I already got 2 vaccines. I don't want to get myocarditis. I realize this is a side effect, and I just don't need to get vaccinated. So why are they forcing me to? It doesn't even make sense, logical sense to me. And yet people just sort of had to accept and go along with those rules. So there was this sort of absurdity to the rules that were put into place. And that's the problem when you take away individual choice, especially for medical decisions, right? Medical bureaucrats, public health bureaucrats do not know what's best for the individual. They're thinking about these abstract things that are called populations. And also within a sort of a group mentality that took hold. And I think part of explaining why that went to such extremes was just the lack within the public health research community of people willing to stand up and say, no, this has gone too far. We've overstepped our ethical framework. So because by most ethical guidelines or accepted norms of ethical practice for public health, those were completely trampled on. Levels of evidence, the precautionary principle. You kind of go down the list of those ethical ideals, and they were sort of thrown out the window. And I think the COVID vaccine mandates were particularly damaging. And and now I read pieces in the New York Times or the Washington Post of people bemoaning the increase in vaccine hesitancy, and some of them don't even have a reference to the COVID vaccine mandates as a driving force to that. So like the lack of self-awareness is quite profound. I think it's starting to shift, but it's going to be a long journey, right? Like the people do not want to admit that they made mistakes. And I think that's certainly like the mission of Collateral Global, is just saying, hey, what were the mistakes? If we, I mean, one of the thought experiments that I like to do is to say, if you were in 2019 And I'll give you the scenario of what happened during COVID. Most of the people would have that promoted these policies or support them today would say, no, 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 I don't think we should do that. So clearly, we threw out what was acceptable. So I don't think that I think that the COVID vaccines in general don't have a very favorable risk benefit assessment below, let's say, 50 or even 60 years old. We have a couple of studies that I want to get off the ground to really dig into the numbers retrospectively to say, well, what, from an evidence standpoint, what can we say now that the pandemic has passed in terms of, vaccine policy? So that's one area that CG is really interested in getting into. But this whole issue around mandates and sort of the regulatory bodies and the way that was communicated to the public, that's a slightly different story and concerning.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. It is interesting to me, I make this comparison with the whole gender, quote unquote, gender medicine nonsense, because one of the things that we're seeing in the UK, now that the Tavistock has been taken to task, now that there have been demands for the end of puberty blockers, and that seems to have been affected, is this: what do you do with all these parents who've given their consent to something of which they had either no information, false information, or absolute political ideology as a surrogate to information, which is exactly what happened during the pandemic, by the way. And I say this because I remember at one point thinking, what are people going to do when they find out that these vaccines were forced upon them and wholly unnecessary? And then I thought, I was talking to someone about this, and we came to the conclusion that the governments would probably not want to release this information because there would be people with torches on the streets. And it's very hard. I mean, you said that earlier, and this is something about human nature that I don't understand personally. The ability to say, I got it wrong. And that's what we need. We need a kind of accountability that you see a lot more, let's say in UK politics, where something is done and an MP does or says something and then they step down. They admit responsibility, they're gone. You rarely see that in American politics and in Canadian politics. Oh no, we've invited a Nazi to Parliament. We stand by that. There was very little contrition about, what really went on. Now, I have to say that all the things that have happened led me to think that it's going to be very hard, not only for the parents of those kids who've survived these kinds of experimental procedures about quote unquote gendered medicine to admit they got it wrong, but it's also the same for people who were willing victims in this. They took the vaccine because they put their faith in Fauci, or they put their faith in what the CDC says or the NIH says. Now, we're seeing that all of that was pretty much, as I said earlier, politics as a surrogate for science. We, follow the science. It's become a joke now, right? I mean, there was following, but it certainly wasn't science that we were following.
Yeah. So I think we might have a different perspective on like the level of clinical harm from the COVID vaccines. But despite that, right, your point about the mandates themselves and also the idea of accountability and transparency with our understanding of risk and safety signals, and like the trust in the government reporting accurately and honestly, that is, I think we see eye to eye on that. There's a large conversation right now about excess mortality. There was a study published last week in the BMJ Public Health, which got a lot of media attention. It was a front page in the Telegraph here in the UK, saying, I think it was the headline was like, excess vaccine deaths are implicated in the excess deaths in Europe. The study, unfortunately, was really crappy. It's a really bad study. They just took data from Our World in Data. It's not even original research. And then they the actual results section is just reporting what is on this online dashboard, saying something along the lines of like there's 3 million excess deaths in Europe from from 2020 to 2022 or 2023, and then sort of having an opinion piece about, well, maybe it's the vaccines. It's really quite astounding that it got published, and the reason is, I think that we do need to have a serious reckoning about vaccine safety and the excess mortality debate, which I personally think is more due to the medium sort of effects of lockdown and the way that people change their behavior around use of the medical system, and then lots of other. It's very multifactorial. So. And I'm just, the kind of conversation about excess mortality needs to take place in a much more rigorous way, because the way that you measure this stuff is actually really complicated. And, what is a normal year of death? Well, okay, you can measure it, and you can actually adjust those in different ways using different techniques. So this is to say that, like, it's going to be a long reckoning with, okay, well, what happened, and how large was the harm? Let's say, how much of it was due to this, how much of it was sort of due to that. But we've lost. We have a crisis of competence also in government in general, and then now also in the scientific community. So I'm still, to give the listeners a sense of the scale, like. Collateral Global, what I'm doing is I'm setting up these country working groups of scientists who are, very evidence-based people who published during the pandemic and didn't go along with the mainstream government narrative, who are critical and wanted to do good research. All of those individuals experience some degree of persecution or be ostracism or conflict in their institutions with their friend networks and other things. So they had to, make a very conscious choice to put the pursuit of truth above the accolades or the benefits of remaining, quiet and not putting their heads above the fray. And we, have probably about 100 of these individuals in these different working groups. We're going to grow up to probably 200 to 300 plus people. And the story is consistent. Junior researchers starting off their career, or people in mid-career, are still very reluctant to take a critical perspective on COVID at the universities. So our universities are not these bastions of freedom of thought. We have a crisis of conformity, right? And an unwillingness to really ask the hard questions, because if you go too far onto one vein, well, that's kind of considered wrongthink. And people, there's a sort of freedom of academic freedom movement that's taken hold in the US. There's the Heterodox Academy, there's FIRE, there's other groups in the UK, not so much in Canada, but there's different disparate groups. This is a major issue at the university level. And we know that universities for a very long time have been overwhelmingly left-leaning, progressive leftists. And, I came out of that. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And, since sort of the probably midway through Trump's presidency, I just sort of realized that all of these categories that don't make any sense to me. But I think that we need to allow investigators to, at the university level, we need to encourage critical thinking. Because the alternative is we get these kind of crappy papers like the one on excess deaths that I was reporting, right? Instead of real good science. And I think that's a crisis that we're seeing across the university system. And a lot of people will say, oh, that's not a big deal, et cetera, until you actually want to investigate a question, or you come up with an answer that's against the dominant narrative. And then you feel the wrath of the herd. So, I experienced that myself during COVID. I was thrown off a couple of grants, particularly about talking about the vaccine mandates. Got very disenchanted with my university at the University of Washington, the School of Public Health, and just realized that, this isn't an environment that's conducive to asking critical questions in many ways.
My criticism of the vaccines are various. I mean, obviously, the lack of ability to make an informed choice. That's the first fallout for me, because you can't have informed consent if there wasn't proper testing done. And a lot of people were able to use the internet and see the average span of time to test a new drug on the market or a new vaccine is not a few months. People
Mm.
were rightfully worried. A
Yeah.
second point, and you can correct me in all this, I mean, I've read quite a bit of literature that says it's actually not advisable to vaccinate an entire population during an outbreak and a pandemic. And so why was most of Italy forced vaccinated? I mean, this is crazy. They didn't do the children because more than the grandmother and grandfather, much more, the sacred cow here is the child, and they dare not because they would have literally been strung up.
Mm.
So I have a bit of worry about I can't say if the vaccine is safe or not, because I think that, well, first of all, which vaccine? We're learning that certain of these big pharma
Yeah. Right. The
were
AstraZeneca.
doctoring, well, they
Right.
doctored their research. And so people are rightfully distrustful of the governments or the health agencies that tell them to get these vaccines, but they're also distrustful of the very companies that made them for good reason. So
Yeah.
how do we get out of this kind of Moebius strip of distrust where we know that these companies developing the vaccine, they were all in competition to rush out the first copy, let's put it that way. And where's the oversight? And where's the Chinese wall also between governments that make these deals saying, okay, we'll vaccinate our population and we'll protect you from lawsuits. And that's effectively what the woman today told me. We have no power here. We can't even take our government to court over this.
Yeah.
And so that's my distrust right there. It's not that there's proven data one way or the other. It's that I think the jury's still out. I mean, how will we be able to prove that so-and-so was actually affected by the vaccine, or it's one of those correlation is not causation?
Yeah. I mean, certainly there are, I mean, this is well documented. Like every vaccine has side effects. The COVID vaccines have been documented, to have been a contributing factor in at least a few thousand deaths globally. Like pathologists, very much correlated this, but we're talking about billions and billions of vaccine doses. So the question isn't whether you have these side effects. There's a huge list of side effects and quite severe ones that are listed on the websites of each of the vaccine manufacturers. The question is at what proportion, right? And does mass vaccination make sense? So vaccines have always had this collectivistic, framework to it. Like even going back to the polio vaccine, right? There's or smallpox vaccine. I mean, this was recognized side effects. And I think your point about, exactly this mandated vaccination comes with a heightened, and we say this in the paper actually that you had quoted earlier. A mandated vaccine comes with an extra degree of transparency that's required to justify it. And we've actually degraded our standards of transparency during the COVID vaccine rollout. So we've made things worse. And when I say we, I mean the academic public health community. So I think that there's a lot to do to build trust there. Having data transparency, so allowing independent research groups to go through the RCT data. I think there's a lot that can be done to rebuild the way that we do these trials. The question is more whether society wants to have that conversation, because we have a narrative of that these vaccines were highly successful, which I think that they were for high risk individuals, older individuals. I mean, that's my presumption.
Yeah.
And I'm not wanting to steamroll everything and just say, oh yeah, it's a poison death pill or whatever, the narrative can be.
Right.
But what we're inhibited from having that conversation because each side is sort of having its trench warfare. So yeah, it's a difficult thing. And one person who's been quite level-headed here from the very beginning is Peter Doshi, who's a professor at the University of Maryland, and he's a senior editor at the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and he wrote a number of well-regarded opinion pieces early on about data transparency, saying the pharmaceutical companies have not released the actual RCT data that allows us to look at their numbers. And they should do that, because also governments are paying huge amounts of money for these products, and we also funded the research that led to their development. So I don't see why we don't have more data transparency, because that would address people's concerns. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
One of the issues that you deal with at Collateral Global is the ideology of public health. Can you talk a bit about the ideology of public health and what reforms are needed in light of what has transpired since 2020?
Yeah, that's a huge topic. And I've kind of touched upon it a little bit today when I was talking about the field of public health harm research, and this idea that public health interventions are inherently a priori, morally good and justifiable, and do not have trade-offs. And we see this a lot with international development programs. Also, you're going to go into rural Africa and build wells, or teach people new farming techniques, and you don't think about, well, actually, what are the existing farming techniques? What are the existing power dynamics around well building? And international development has a huge history of broken projects that never worked, wasted money, and actually the creation of elite networks that disrupt communities in ways that are not beneficial. And so public health sort of has its own legacy that it needs to deal with. And going back to an earlier point I also mentioned, was the relationship of public health science and the state. So public health has always had an authoritarian aspect to it, whether in terms of religious ideas of purity, cleanliness, disease control during outbreaks. It's very much been linked to the nation of, the purity of the nation state, the power of the nation state, which is why we have this persistent metaphorical use of wartime metaphors in public health discourse. Right, the enemy is the virus, and we need to fight it, and sort of we need to mobilize people against the enemy. But I think in our current variant of public health ideology, it's also what I see on the left is as society has become less and less religious, and we've kind of sort of shed the traditional shared religious iconography of the Christian story in the West, at least. That the public health plays a role, that it has a quasi-religious, savior-esque tint to it for people, right? And you see this in the climate debate as well, right? We need to save Mother Earth. And I think that those sentiments came up very strongly during COVID as well.
Well, I asked you to sort of go over some of those points as a result of the abuse of power from Italy to the US, from the CDC, NIH, and the WHO. We're seeing what has been called by Roger Koppel the expert failure in the system. Right. But in the aftermath of this public disaster, the WHO was asked to write a pandemic treaty on how to respond to the inevitable next pandemic in order to avoid the missteps and the disparities of the last one. There are also calls for the NIH and the CDC to emit reforms. But it's really a little too late. A little too late if none of these agencies can admit the massive failures from beginning to end. That's one of my thoughts. But I'd like to know if you could talk about the WHO treaty and then the NIH and CDC reforms.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, this is really like the core raison d'etre of CG is like, hey, we're going to do COVID evaluations properly so that we learn the lessons from COVID. And so then public health can think about, well, how do we reform ourselves? How do we conduct ourselves differently in the future? And so that's really what we're trying to do in various different countries. And, if any listeners here are passionate about that, I would encourage you to get in contact with me, because we can certainly use all the help we can get. In terms of the WHO treaty, I mean, and Jay and I wrote an op-ed about this for Real Clear Politics, where we've just made what I think is a pretty eloquent and very simple argument, which is the WHO has not reckoned with the mistakes that it had during COVID. It hasn't actually really done a soul searching period. So why, and also governments around the world are still evaluating their COVID response. So why are we now going to agree on how we should conduct ourselves in a future pandemic when we haven't really digested what just happened? That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, you wouldn't do that at a personal level in your own sort of life, kind of just keep on going without actually reflecting seriously about what just took place and the mistakes that you had. So why do we think that we can do that with an international body? It seems irresponsible. I don't seeing kind of the way that the pandemic, the way that things are going. The IHR amendments passed. They were quite watered down. There's sort of two small things there. The inclusion of misinformation as a sort of thing that needs to be addressed, and then this whole of society approach to pandemic response. And I think that those are more reflections of the discipline itself, the pandemic industry, and where it's at. It's up to countries to decide how they're going to incorporate that language into national laws. The sovereignty critique of WHO, so they'll say, oh, there's no sovereignty issue here. The thing is, if you go back to the original IHR amendments in 2005, after the 2003 SARS outbreak, it's true, right? Countries can implement this in different ways, but what happens is a country will sort of just adopt the WHO language, and then there's a socialization process that happens through these focal people, and they do influence the national regulations. And so I don't think, as an example, I don't think Britain would have used the Public Health Act for lockdown, which lasted almost 2 years here, had the IHR amendments not been, or the IHR not been done in 2005. So the idea that this isn't going to influence national laws, I just don't think that that's true. It's just a long process. It's more of a windy road. I think the pandemic treaty has been delayed. I think that there is going to be some signing of the pandemic treaty in 6 to 12 months. The major reason that it didn't go ahead isn't having to do with what we were talking about today. It's more about countries in the global south, mostly in Africa, wanting to get more out of the bargain, right? Because let's say if they provide genomic sequences of a new virus, they want to have a better deal to get access to the therapeutics, drugs, and tests that the corporations in Europe and North America or wherever are going to develop. That's the real reason that it wasn't signed. So I think that there's going to be some watered down pandemic treaty version that goes ahead. The question more is, how do we hold these institutions accountable and reform them, which is a huge cultural issue. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's cultural and terribly political, because in countries as democratic as Italy, let's say, you were persona non grata if you raised your eyebrows about any of what happened here in polite society. And
Right.
this raises greater issues when you talk about that 20%. There need to be stipulations for resistors and refuseniks. I hate to say it, because if it's Ebola, it won't go well for any of us if those people are out there.
Right.
But at the same time, they were the sanity during this. I was one of them, but at the time, I didn't realize I was. I was just like, whoa, this wasn't the planned pandemic response. What happened to targeted protection, right?
Yeah.
It seems that we're not only in a kind of erosion of democracy, but we're public health, ethics, and law are in a full free fall right now. And will it be enough that you have someone, let's say the current leader of the Philippines, in charge of this kind of policy when he's not the most trustworthy person when it comes to other kinds of political issues, if you follow me? I just worry that the kind of WHO treaty that may be signed by various countries will vinculate the populations that might otherwise be skeptical. And I think the skepticism is something that's core, not only to democracy, but I think it's core to our intellectual and psychological survival. Because what happened to us here in Italy was off the charts crazy. And I see a lot of people, are still suffering. The government had to open this psychology bonus to help people pay for psychologists without, of course, referencing why. It's just a coincidence. You've seen these rolled out in France as well, by the way. And a lot of people are still not willing to talk about what happened. Do you think that might be part of this principle that we can't admit, not only that we were wrong to take the vaccine, we were duped. People don't want to admit that, but some people are more predisposed to protect their government by any means necessary.
I mean, yeah, I think that I can understand why people wanted to get vaccinated, because we were told a narrative that we would, if everyone got vaccinated, we would reach this herd immunity threshold, which was imaginary, and then we
Right.
could, go back to normal. So the advertising for the product was faulty, right? In terms of the promises that were made. And this gets back to why people are quite upset about it, including many people who were vaccinated and didn't experience side effects. There's more of a sense that they were the authorities weren't completely transparent and honest about what was known and what was unknown, which gets to a bigger issue around communication, right? Like there was a lot of different ways that we could have communicated uncertainty while still promoting reasonable infection control practices, and that's really like an unfortunate casualty here.